Our story begins after the Dinobots had just killed the clone of Shockwave and realized that, yeah, it's a clone, so Shockwave's not even here. And so they pretty much just evacuated everybody and, got the last transportation ships out. However, there's one change in this timeline. When Ultra Magnus offers them to go with him, they actually aren't really ready to take that offer, aren't ready to go to Earth. However, Ultra Magnus simply states that Shockwave would likely be on Earth, considering the fact that he's not here with anyone on Cybertron. He should be on Earth. This means the Dinobots actually believe, like, you know what? Yeah, let's actually go. We can get back on Shockwave. So, just like in the original, RC does meet Ultra Magnus, and this is where he states that, yes, he's found few Autobots and found some great reinforcements. And so the Dinobots would actually come out off the ship here, and RC would be a little bit shocked until Ultra Magnus actually explains what went down with him on Cybertron and explaining that this used to be the Lightning Strike Collision Force. And so RC puts two and two together, and she goes from surprised to calm to angry within a heartbeat. And she simply states, wait, you're the team that abandoned your posts and left Iacon vulnerable? And this is where Slug interjects and states they weren't abandoning their posts. They were captured and experimented on by Shockwave. And this is where RC states you guys wouldn't have been captured if you hadn't left your positions in the first place. Cybertron could have been better off if you guys had stayed put. And this is where Slug simply states that if Optimus had actually listened to them in the first place, they wouldn't have to go out of their way to discover an energon supply that could have saved Cybertron. And this is where Grimlock tells both of them to simply stand down, as right now this is not the time for this, and simply asks RC, where are the rest of the Autobots? Into which RC is like, I'm not really willing to tell those who abandoned us before. What? So you could just make sure that you don't go near us again? However, Ultra Magnus puts his foot down, and that's when they find out about, kind of all the events that happened. But eventually, just like in the original, they do fight against the Predacon the first time, or at least evade them. And then they do manage to regroup with Ratchet. And this is where Bulkhead and Wheeljack are like, oh, shoot. Commander, is this? Yes, this is the Dinobots and everything. And this is where, at the planning stage of this video, or at the planning stage of the Dark Mount raid, this is where everything goes differently, with Sludge actually stating that they'll be able to handle the Dinobot. And yeah, this is where the Dark Mount raid goes vastly differently, unlike the original. And because they have, the Dinobots here, this means that everything goes completely in the Autobots' favor. And I'm talking about way before Optimus arrives. The Dinobots provide the perfect way to execute any Decepticon soldiers. And, this is where Shockwave sends out the Predacon on Megatron's command. Because, again, Megatron knows of the Lightning Strike Collision Force, but he doesn't know that their whole Dinobot thing or whatever is, kind of a thing. However, when they transform, this is where Starscream's like, what? The Autobots have their own beasts? That's cheating. How do they get 5 of them? And so this is where their plan against Predacon actually goes, actually gets executed. Swoop flies up and actually intercepts Predacon diving down, scratching at his eye and actually causing it to spill energon. However, Swoop's not done, as he actually maneuvers himself around Predacon, who's trying to chase him, and flings him right towards the ground. This is where Snarl actually comes in and tail whips the Predacon in the side. Keep in mind, they would actually be at full strength this time and not weakened like they were on Cybertron, because Ultra Magnus would have definitely had them, fuel up on any energon reserves that he had on his ship. But back to the fight. This is where Slug comes in and rams into the side of the Predacon, allowing him to get tossed right into Sludge, who actually comes down full force in his beast form, flattening Predacon and holding him in place, allowing Grimlock to come in with his blazing sword and decapitates Predacon, killing the Predacon easily. This means that RC, Bumblebee, Wheeljack, and Bulkhead are the ones to pretty much infiltrate and actually do manage to confiscate any relics that were remaining, like the Polarity Gauntlet, the Apex Armor, the Immobilizer, and etc. However, Ultra Magnus still gets floored by Megatron, and, well, gets dragged to the top of it, and is kind of a little bit taken aback by everything that's pretty much happened. However, this is where, just like in the original, Optimus comes in. Pretty much comes in and saves Ultra Magnus just like the original. And he says, "Sir, you're looking robust." And he says, "Commander, and you brought reinforcements." Well, and this is where Grimlock kind of just gives like a grudging nod to Optimus. And, well, you know, Darkmount kind of goes the same, and the Autobots head back to base to where they are celebrating their triumphant return. And, well, the Dinobots are kind of in the back, kind of keeping to themselves right now as the Autobots are celebrating. And, well, they don't really like this. It's too early. It's too, I guess you could say, problematic at the moment for them actually having to celebrate this kind of thing. And this is where Slug simply asks Grimlock, "Hey, can we leave this nonsense right now?" And Grimlock's like, yeah, let's head out right now. So the Dinobots, instead of staying around and celebrating, actually do wind up leaving while the Autobots are kind of in this situation. And Optimus tells them to wait, as he does want to discuss apparently the issues Ultra Magnus told me about with, well, the Dinobots and their, I guess you could say, conflict with the Autobots. However, Grimlock's like, "No, we don't need to discuss it. There's nothing that needs to be discussed at the moment. We could leave it be and possibly just work around it." However, Optimus is kind of more firm in this one, as again, he does have a new body. And if I had to say how they look, I would probably say he's around the same height as Grimlock, considering the size difference between him and Megatron. If not, Grimlock is slightly taller. However, Grimlock is a little adamant about this, stating that no, they don't need to discuss this at all. And this is where, you know, the Autobots and the other Dinobots kind of crowd around both of them, where Sludge stating that they have no reason to really explain anything to Optimus. And so this heated argument between them actually results in RC actually being the one to point her blaster at Slug, who she's arguing with, stating that how could she actually trust them after all the things that they've done, always rebelling against the Autobot cause, and always, you know, abandoning them when they have the opportunity. And Slug even turns into his Triceratops form and tells her, "Go ahead, take the shot." And Optimus actually has to be the one to de-escalate the situation. As of right now, the team is really not liking each other, at least both sides. And this is where a Grimlock must have a reason or a reasonable explanation for abandoning his post. And this was Grimlock is like, "All right, you want to hear my reason? Let's talk about it. During the earlier wars of the days for Cybertron, Optimus, we gave you everything. Frontline information, the best coordinated strategies, but you always played defensive." And this is where Optimus simply states, because they had the Ark to build, because they didn't have enough Energon. And this is where Grimlock retorts, "They also gave you information, or we also gave you information about the Decepticons always looking fresh. Like they never had any problem with Energon while we were struggling, even giving Optimus the recording." And Optimus goes silent for a moment. "You never looked at it. You never played the video." And he knows this because Perceptor, God rest his spark, or Primus rest his spark, told him. And Optimus simply nods and states, no, he didn't. And maybe if he did, things would have gone differently. That Energon supply was taken into consideration after we found it out, thanks to Jazz and Cliffjumper's efforts. And this is where Grimlock simply states, "You mean our efforts. We were the ones that gave you those coordinates. We were the one that literally had to sneak out in order to discover this for ourselves. Had you actually listened the first time, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation." To which Wheeljack says, "Well, I guess Prime's not really the best leader everyone's cracked him up to be." And so the Autobots kind of go silent, and they're like, dang, maybe we all do have our flaws. But this is where Smokescreen interjects and simply states, "Well, that's no reason for you guys to really be so begrudging to Optimus. And maybe, yeah, we all could be better, But there's no reason for that. And this is where Swoop simply interjects and states that, kid, stay out of it and mind your business. And this is where Ultra Magnus states, look, all right, we all clearly have some issues in some situations. But right now, we need to improve on both sides to be better. Right now, we have the Decepticons to worry about. And infighting helps no one but them. So right now, we need to be at our best at all costs. Understood? And so this is where the Dinobots kind of roll their optics and says, yeah, whatever you say, Magnus. And they all simply leave. To which Optimus states that, maybe he should have actually taken their advice early on. And so we would head over to Decepticon warship where Megatron and Shockwave are looking over the remains of Predacon. To which Megatron simply states, perhaps having more Predacons is the way to go. Those Dinobots seem very formidable. And Shockwave does state that he has decoded the coordinates for the rest of the remaining of the Predacon fossils. And Megatron says, good, let's get to work. And this is where we actually go back to the Autobot base, or Autobot Hangar E, and we actually see Wheeljack actually working on some of his explosives with Miko. However, this is where Sludge actually comes in, and she says, wait a minute, you're working with him? Well, that's kind of surprising. And this is where Sludge simply states, don't read too much into it, human. He's here to simply deliver supplies and to keep it going. And this kind of shows that the Autobots and Dinobots are trying to get along, and even with the humans, it's still kind of it's an iffy relationship at best. Meanwhile, Ultra Magnus and Grimlock are actually discussing battle tactics that could actually give them the edge. However, Swoop actually comes in stating he hasn't found the Decepticon warship. And this is where Ultra Magnus actually does state that Swoop's efforts are still valuable and tells him to go ahead and take a break. And this kind of shows the dynamic between Ultra Magnus and the Dinobots, because again, they've had a lot more time to get along with each other, to actually understand each other. And Swoop simply nods and walks off. However, as he does walk off, he does pass Optimus and RC, who are both conversating with each other, with RC stating that she really doesn't trust them after the whole fall of Cybertron. And Optimus does state while her friend's trusts aren't entirely misplaced, they are still Autobots who had reasons. And Optimus even admits that maybe if he had taken responsibility earlier, they wouldn't have been in this situation. However, this is where Ratchet actually begins to pick up on something, thanks to the fact that the Autobots would now have the Harbinger's tech. And I actually do think it makes more sense for the Autobots to have it than to not have it. So, picking up on the first Predacon fossil, Optimus actually states that he wants Grimlock and RC to be the ones to go to these coordinates. And well, RC is just simply like, fine, I guess we'll make this work after all. And so she's the one to kind of step first through the ground bridge while Grimlock follows suit. And RC says, don't think about abandoning me anytime soon. And this is where Grimlock simply has it. He's kept his temper with everyone for so long, but this is where he not only summons his sword, but he slams it right on the ground next to RC. Simply states, look, he has his reasons, and his intentions were to get the Autobots a stable energon supply for the Ark, but your fearless leader decided not to listen. And this is where RC, a little bit taken aback, because again, no one really kind of stands up to her in an abrasive way, actually states, all right, she gets it. And Grimlock says, good. So they both head into this Decepticon mining. And this is where we actually have, the Decepticons and some Insecticons actually digging for the Predacon fossil, along with the likes of Megatron. And Megatron does eventually spot that Grimlock and RC have just entered the mine. And RC states to Decepticons to hand over the Predacon fossil before things get ugly, with the Grimlock replying with a nod and summoning his blade. However, Megatron says, Insecticons, deal with these pests, while the mining crew does manage to, get with the fossil or attack the fossil, or, dig for the fossil. And so the Insecticons all simply attack just like they would against Optimus. I'm going to have this be like the same location that Optimus unveiled his vehicle form, right? And so Grimlock says, "Little bugs, do your worst," and turns into his Dinobot form to where he simply chomps, stomps, and simply begins to tear through the Insecticons. RC, however, transforms and drives ahead and actually begins to disable the Decepticon miners like they're, well, light work. They actually kind of are at this point. However, this leads to her getting grabbed, slammed, and then kicked against the wall by Megatron, who actually just simply looks at her like, and they send the weakest of the Autobots and actually summons his sword and is getting ready to kill her. However, this is where he feels something slam into the back of him and send him crashing towards the wall. And it's Grimlock with his sword and shield form, and well, right behind him is a dozen corpses of burning and chomped in half Insecticons. And he tells Megatron, "This ends here," and not only grabs Megatron in his Tyrannosaurus form, but begins to manhandle and ragdoll him. Keep in mind, this is still kind of like a Predacon in a way. And so Megatron, after a while, is in the same position he had with Optimus, where he simply states, "I'm guessing you're not as merciful as Optimus." And Grimlock says, "You're very perceptive." Because he isn't. And so as Grimlock goes to chomp on Megatron's head, a ground bridge opens beneath him, and Megatron and the Fossil both fall into the Decepticon warship, with Soundwave looking at him and checking on him if he's okay. Grimlock is, pissed off that he didn't get a chance to kill Megatron, but this is where he walks over to RC and simply helps her up and asks her if, she's okay. RC now has a much better perspective on Grimlock at this point, albeit there's still that little bit part of her that doesn't like the fact that, well, they did abandon the Autobot still. But again, she does state that, yeah, they're fine. And Grimlock simply states, "Good. Now let's report back to base and, give them the information." And that's going to leave it off here, you guys. Please comment down below, like and subscribe, and share with your friends.